Welcome back, everybody, to another lecture here in History 1301, and today what we're going to be going over is that of the prelude to the Revolution, picking back up where we had left off last time with the French and Indian War. Now, when we talked about the French and Indian War, we saw that at the conclusion of that conflict, Great Britain emerged as the victor. They had conquered Canada, and with it they had gained massive amounts of territory, especially over in North America. However, while the English will have a much larger empire, a larger empire does not mean that they would have less problems, but actually the exact opposite. Because we'll see in the years afterwards, after 1763, there will be many issues that the British are going to have to address. And foremost amongst those is how to run these new colonies, how to fund them, and then also how to pay off the debts that they had incurred during the previous conflict. And we're going to see how, when the British Parliament looks to address those issues, how it's going to have a tremendous impact on the colonists. Now, in our build-up to the American Revolution, as I had mentioned in the last video prior to this, when we talked about the French and Indian War, it is because of the French and Indian War that we ultimately have the Revolution. Because without those conflicts that were associated with the French and Indian War, it would not lead us down this road to revolution where the British Parliament would issue taxes that the colonists would be so upset about. And so today we're going to be focusing on some of those taxes and ultimately why are the colonists so upset about them being levied against them. Now, up on the board, just really quick, I wanted to clarify, just because I didn't have a whole lot of room, but I've put the 7 Years' War. Once again, the 7 Years' War is the same thing as the French and Indian War. But anyways, like all conflicts, the French and Indian War, it proved to be extremely expensive. We had ended on the note that it had costed the British Crown roughly about 140 million pounds. Now, once again, translate that over to inflation, it's a lot of money. But anyways, this money to pay off these debts will have to come from somewhere. And the British Parliament, immediately after the war, beginning really the following year after 1763, they're going to look to the colonists to pay their fair share for the recent conflict. Now, why are they targeting the colonists in particular? Why not people back over in Great Britain or somewhere else within their empire? Well, it's strictly for the fact that the people living in the British Isles at this time were some of the most heavily taxed peoples in the world. And if we compare them to the amount of taxes that they paid in comparison to the American colonists, it was almost 26 times the amount the colonists paid in regards to their taxes. Now, why is this the case? Why hasn't, up to this point, Great Britain taxed very heavily the colonies like it has its people back over in the British Isles? It's because, if we remember back a couple of lectures, the colonists, they were allowed to dictate their own tax code. They established their own colonial assemblies who had issued their own taxes in the name of the crown. And a large reason for this was because, one, they were self-governing colonies, but two, it was also because we see that barrier of roughly 3,000 miles of ocean, the Atlantic. And so the colonists were really in the best position to collect their own taxes as opposed to Parliament. But that will change after the 7 Years' War / the French and Indian War, because by this point, with this very costly war, really a war that was fought for the benefit of the colonists, Parliament is going to try to get the colonists to pay their fair share in taxes. Not a very unreasonable request. However, the colonists will be very upset with this. Now, the series of taxes that will be levied against the American colonies is really going to begin with the Sugar Act of 1764, to where French molasses, as well as you can probably guess by the name of the act, sugar, is going to be taxed. Now, this isn't going to impact all colonists, but it was a scheme to try to generate some revenue in the colonies to pay for the war. However, we start to see really develop with this act, and especially with the Stamp Act, which will follow the following year, many individuals were disgruntled over in the colonies. And why was that? Well, it's because Parliament was issuing these taxes, not their colonial assemblies, as was tradition. And they were being sidestepped because of this. Not to mention, over in Parliament, there was no representation from the British colonists back over in Parliament. And so this idea of no taxation without representation really begins to emerge around this point, because they did not think it was fair that, one, British Parliament should overrule their own colonial assemblies, but two, that they should be these taxes should be leveled against them, since they did not have any representation back over in Parliament. But anyways, this begins with the Sugar Act. But really, the situation over in the American colonies is going to escalate with the passage of an act in 1765, better known to the Americans as the dreaded Stamp Act. Now, the Stamp Act that will be passed in 1765, it will be the brainchild of the Prime Minister at the time of Great Britain, that of George Grenville, who wants the colonists to pay their fair share in revenue and in taxes for the recent conflict. Not to mention, he also wants them to pay for some of those British troops who were guarding the frontier at this point. And the reason he introduces the Stamp Act is because it will generate enough revenue to begin this process. Now, the Stamp Act, it's not going to be like the Sugar Act, where it will only target a few individuals in American society, but rather it's going to target virtually every single American across the Atlantic seaboard at this point. The Stamp Act is going to put a tax on stamps. Now, why are stamps so significant? And you may be thinking, well, you only have to pay this tax if you send out letters. Well, stamps at the time, they're applied to basically every single legal/paper document that is in the American colonies. Obviously, with letters, you would have a stamp that would be on it, and when paying for the stamp, you pay this tax. On top of that, if you were to get married or divorced, those legal documents required stamps. If you were to purchase land, you needed a stamp on that document. Even playing cards would be stamped at this point, and this quite literally will impact every single American because of this, not to mention other documents that I did not mention. And this is going to lead to widespread unrest over in the American colonies by the middle of 1765, to where they will call on delegates to form a Congress to hopefully issue a response to the British Parliament and protest to hopefully overturn the Stamp Act. Now, this Congress will meet in October 1765, and they will be known as the Stamp Act Congress. And this will be the first congressional, continental-wide body that will convene in protest to British taxes as well as British policies. Now, Stamp Act Congress will see many of the leading delegates across the United States at the time. Individuals like John Dickinson, Patrick Henry will be present at it. And they will issue a formal grievance clause back over to Parliament. And also at the Stamp Act Congress, they're going to call on a colonial-wide boycott to take effect, because they want to hurt the British where it hurts them the most, in their pocketbook. Because their hope was that by conducting this colonial-wide boycott, what would ultimately happen is British merchants who were no longer selling goods over in the American colonies because of this boycott, well, they would begin to lose profits. This would maybe create a small economic depression, and with this pressure, these merchants would pressure Parliament to overturn the Stamp Act. And this will have a significant effect as we start to see organizations like the Sons of Liberty as well as the Daughters of Liberty begin to sponsor protests, the boycotts themselves, as well as fundraising missions to oppose this recent Stamp Act. And we'll see that British imports will fall by roughly about 40%, and it will have a tremendous impact on the British economy. And by the beginning of 1766, it's to no surprise that we see these merchants, just as the colonists had predicted, begin to protest Parliament to overturn the Stamp Act. And by the beginning of 1766, there will be an act passed repealing the Stamp Act, a major victory for the colonists. And they will realize moving forward they could use this method of the boycott to overturn future policies, to try to get the British Parliament to stay out of their affairs. However, the same day that we see the repeal of the Stamp Act, we're also going to see that the British Parliament is going to issue the Declaratory Act, basically stating that moving forward, regardless of what kind of tax, regardless of what kind of policy is passed by the British Parliament towards their colonies, they had to submit and they had to listen, or the Parliament could take further steps in making them submit and listen to these policies. However, for the time being, during the year 1766, most of the Americans are going to rejoice. And ironically, what we're going to see is back over in the American colonies, even though these British colonists had boycotted the Stamp Act, the farthest thing from their mind at this point was breaking away from Great Britain. They would make arguments at this time that nowhere else in the world could they successfully protest an act by their government than in the British Empire. And they will be very happy British citizens because of this. And this is part of the transition we'll see, because over the course of the next decade, they're going to go from these proud, loyal British subjects ultimately to almost reluctant rebels. And we'll talk about it here in just a moment. But anyways, the Stamp Act won't be the last major set of acts that will be passed to try to generate revenue and taxes over in the colonies. The year after the Stamp Act is repealed in 1767, we'll see the passage of another series of acts that will look to raise revenue, this time on what's known as the Townshend Acts. Now, the Townshend Acts themselves, they will be the brainchild of a new a new chief of the Treasury Department over in Great Britain, that of Charles Townshend. Now, he is going to die in the middle of 1767, but before his death, what will be really his lasting legacy is he's going to push forth a series of acts that are going to try to get the colonists to submit to British authority and reimpose some of these taxes. Now, there are 5 Townshend Acts that you can read about in your textbook. However, the one I'm going to point out is going to be that of the Revenue Act, which by the name you can guess it is trying to generate revenue and put a tax on things like glass, lead, paint, sugar, tobacco, as well as other products to get the colonists to pay taxes to pay off for the 7 Years' War. Well, just like the Stamp Act before it, the colonists aren't going to be thrilled with this, and they're going to once again stage a colonial-wide boycott that will become widespread the following year in 1768. Now, with the Townshend Acts in particular, I want to shift our focus for the rest of this lecture to what was beginning to develop in the colony of Massachusetts, because what develops there will be crucial for the escalation eventually to open rebellion for the American colonists. Now, Massachusetts had heavily opposed the Stamp Act, and they will heavily oppose the Townshend Acts. But anyways, 2 noteworthy Bostonians, as well as Massachusetts colonists, by the name of Samuel Adams, as well as James Otis Jr., they're going to put through the Massachusetts state legislature a circulatory letter, basically declaring that their legislature should declare the Townshend Acts illegal and reject to enforce them. Now, the legislature was leaning to passing these, but when the royal governor of Massachusetts at the time finds out about the circulatory letter, he's basically going to give an ultimatum. He's going to tell the Massachusetts state legislature to withdraw this or basically face the consequences. Well, they're going to refuse to withdraw this, and by the middle of 1768, he's going to call on the king to send over British troops to Boston to restore basically law and order. And by October of 1768, we see the arrival of the first British troops, which, with their arrival, are not going to ease tensions. They're not going to restore law and order, but rather they're going to heighten tensions. Now, in the midst of all this, one thing I want to point out really quickly is American colonists who are in Boston at this time, there's going to be 2 groups of Americans who are going to view these soldiers in 2 different lights. Many American colonists, who will fall under the Patriot category in days to come, they will heavily oppose these soldiers arriving. They see that a standing army within their colonies was basically the beginning of tyranny. And so they will be very discontent with the arrival of these soldiers. But that's not going to be all colonists. There were still a several number of colonists who will fall under the Tory or the Loyalist faction, who actually see the arrival of these British soldiers as an attempt to restore law and order, and who will, over time, support the actions of the Crown, even if it is withdrawing some of their rights over in the American colonies. And we'll see moving forward that this will create almost kind of a civil war within the Revolutionary period, but we'll talk about that more once we get to the Revolution. But nonetheless, tensions will continue to heighten as we see these troops arrive. But they won't boil over until we get to 1770, when we'll see a series of clashes, I should say violent clashes, occur between the colonists as well as these soldiers that arrive over in the American colonies. Now, really quick, there are several violent instances that you can read about in your textbook, but there's one in particular that I want to point out that's going to be crucial in the development of the Revolution, and it's going to be that of the Boston Massacre. Now, the Boston Massacre itself is going to occur on the night of March 5th, 1770. Now, what was basically occurring that night is most of the Bostonian citizens were going out responding to a local fire. So just kind of a side note of information, there were no fire departments within Boston at this time, so basically how you put out these fires is the whole town would come out with their own buckets, go out to their local well, and put out the fire that way. But anyways, as they were responding to this local fire, they will hear off in the distance several shots that will be fired. Many will arrive over to where these shots had occurred, and they will see 8 British soldiers as well as their commanding officer with their rifles leveled, with smoke beginning just to kind of dissipate, and they will see 5 Americans dead. Now, with this scene, they're going to be completely outraged. And we'll see the day after the Boston Massacre occurs, these 9 British soldiers are going to be arrested, and they're going to be tried before a Bostonian court. And as you could probably guess, being tried before a Bostonian court, before a Bostonian jury, and a Bostonian judge, the colonists aren't going to look at these soldiers in a very favorable light. But nonetheless, with the efforts of John Adams, who would be the defense lawyer for these soldiers, they would be acquitted. Because the reality of the situation was, these British soldiers were being harassed by the colonists. They were having rocks thrown at them, snowballs, as well as even clubs by this point. And really what had happened was what would be depicted in the colonial press as this innocent mob had begun to surround them. And there was 300 individuals, and as you could probably guess, these 8 individuals, even though they had guns, they were very much scared for their lives. And as that angry mob made their way around them, they would begin to shout, "Fire, fire," to get them to fire, and that's ultimately what happened. But nonetheless, they would be acquitted, or 7 of them would be acquitted of their crimes. 2 of them would ultimately be punished, but it would be very minor punished. But nonetheless, this was an early action that we see to where the clashes between the British soldiers as well as the colonists were beginning to turn deadly, and where the colonial press wanted to take advantage of the situation to hopefully heighten what was beginning to develop in the American colonies and lead us down the road to potential rebellion. But anyways, through this show, they were hoping that the Parliament would overturn some of their policies. Now, after the Boston Massacre, not a lot's going to occur over the course of the next several years, even with these heightening tensions. However, that will all change in 1773, because the British Parliament is going to issue what's known as the Tea Act of that year. Now, the Tea Act itself, it actually could benefit the American colonies, and it's going to have 2 major purposes. The first purpose for this Tea Act, Lord North, who was the British Prime Minister at the time, he had a big concern, especially with a major British company, that of the British East India Company, who was a major manufacturer as well as a seller of tea. At this point, not a lot of people were buying tea back over in England, and the storehouses that they had filled with tea, well, they were about to spoil. And if that were to happen, then the company itself would lose millions of dollars in pounds, or since saying millions of dollars, they would lose millions of pounds, and perhaps this could lead the company to becoming bankrupt. Now, and to ensure that this does not happen, this is where Lord North will devise the Tea Act, to send this tea untaxed over to the American colonies to have them purchase it. And this is where it would achieve that other major goal. It, 1, save that British East India Company, but 2, even though there wasn't any tax really involved with this Tea Act, hopefully the colonists would accept this act, and by doing so they would submit to British authority, and then he could begin to raise taxes and pay off that revenue loss that we see from the 7 Years' War. And so he will put this through Parliament through the summer of 1773, and by the early fall of 1773, word of the Tea Act is going to arrive back over in the colonies. But it's not going to generate support. Rather, it's going to generate widespread outrage, because many colonists, especially members of that group, the Sons of Liberty, realized that this was an effort by the British Parliament to get them to submit to their authority. And this will form a large, or ultimately will form a large protest that has gone down in history as the Boston Tea Party. Now, the Boston Tea Party itself, it will be a part of this boycott that was devised by mainly Bostonian citizens in response to the Tea Act. Now, just a little bit of background information. There was another law that was important to these Bostonians. If a ship arrived, let's say in this case, these British ships arrived with that tea. If the ships weren't offloaded in 20 days, well, they would be taken back to England. Now, they will form a boycott, basically telling all smugglers, telling all sailors, as well as merchants within Boston, to not unload these ships. So that way, they could not go into their storehouses, and eventually, over time, if not sold, be taxed, and they would not be liable for them. Well, the Parliament had come prepared and sent the initial 3 ships with this British tea, basically with another proclamation stating that if this 20 days were to expire and the British colonists in Boston did not unload this tea, that it was to be forced into their storehouses. And the date set for that 20-day mark would be December 17th. However, the previous night, to ensure that this British tea would not find its way into the storehouses within Boston, we'll see that they would stage basically a nonviolent protest of throwing off those crates of British tea out into Boston Harbor. This is where we'll see roughly about 150 to 300 members of the Sons of Liberty dressed as Mohawk Indians, and crowds of a few thousand people will gather on the shoreline in the midst of night on December 16th. Now, contrary to popular belief, really the Boston Tea Party is not going to be this riotous affair. It's not going to be really loud, but rather it's going to be this very quiet affair in the middle of the night. And one writer would go on to state that this was the quietest and most peaceful night that Boston had experienced in years to come. However, with these actions, it would prove to be one of the last days for years to come where they would have this peace and quiet. Because as soon as word of the Boston Tea Party arrives back to Parliament, Parliament is going to be outraged because millions of dollars or millions of pounds of British tea had just been destroyed. This effectively was vandalism, and they will look to ensure that the Bostonians would pay for damaging this tea. And early in 1774, this is where Parliament's going to pass the Coercive Acts, or better known to the American colonists as the Intolerable Acts. Now, the Intolerable Acts themselves, it will consist of 4 major acts, and I'll go through each one really quickly. The first was the Boston Port Act. Now, the Boston Port Act wasn't really a well-thought-out act by the British Parliament, but nonetheless, it was meant to try to get all of this money that the Bostonians had, or I should say, all this tea that the Bostonians had thrown into Boston Harbor paid back for. And through the Boston Port Act, the Port of Boston would be shut down until the colonists in Boston paid back the British East India Company for that tea. Well, why is that not necessarily a smart act by Parliament? Well, it's because Boston's entire community centered around trade. So if you cut off their trade, they're not going to make any money. If they're not making any money, they cannot pay off for that damaged tea. On top of that, there would also be a quartering act that would be included in this. There would be British soldiers who would come out from local forts who had been there since the Boston Massacre to ease tensions, who would begin to occupy the city. And they would be forced, or I shouldn't say they would be forced, the colonists would be forced to house them if the royal governor called on them to house these troops. There would also be a Justice Act that would be pushed forth as a part of the Intolerable Acts, basically stating that moving forward, any colonist, any smuggler, anybody in general who was arrested in Boston, they would be tried not before a Bostonian court, but rather before a military tribunal up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And this took away power from the judiciary system in Boston. And lastly, there was a Massachusetts Governor Act, which will completely strip the Massachusetts colony from its right to have its own colonial assembly and issue its own laws. It basically creates a police state, if you will, within Boston. Now, the grand question is, this is what occurs in Boston and in Massachusetts, but how do the other colonies respond to this? Well, the hope from Parliament was that by issuing such harsh acts, the other colonies would fall in line. They would not issue boycotts, but they would rather be so scared that they wouldn't want to challenge British authority. It's going to have the exact opposite effect, because the colonists will realize that if the British could do this to Boston and to Massachusetts, they could do it to their very own colonies. And after we see the Intolerable Acts put into place, there will be a call from all of the colonies to form once again another Congress to form a boycott against these British acts that we've seen passed in recent days. And that Congress would become known as the First Continental Congress. Now, the First Continental Congress itself, it will convene in early September of 1774, and it will be in protest to these recent Intolerable Acts. There will be a set of declarations that would be issued by the First Continental Congress to go back over to Britain to basically condemn these recent acts and to ask the king, who they viewed as this patriot king, to overturn these acts and restore order back to the colonial assemblies within the American colonies. Now, at the First Continental Congress, once again, the furthest thing from their minds was this idea of independence. They were merely looking for the restoration of their rights as Englishmen, not for declaring independence. That will come in the next Continental Congress that we'll talk about when we get to the Revolution itself. But anyways, they will also issue several declarations to where they would call on the people of Massachusetts that if Great Britain continued to press forth with this policy, that they should take up arms, begin to stack them, and if necessarily, openly rebel against the British, these British actions. In the meantime, what we're also going to see is that with the Continental Congress, they're going to establish something even more significant. By the end of October, this First Continental Congress will adjourn. They will leave session. And they will pass one last resolution that if the following year, in 1775, if these Intolerable Acts had not been overturned and that the British Parliament was continuing to press their stance, well, they would form a second Continental Congress. And that Continental Congress will be significant, especially in leading us down the road to independence. But that's a topic for the time being. In the meantime, even with these calls for the king to address their grievances, even with these declarations being issued, tensions are only going to continue to mount. And neither side, the colonists nor the British Parliament, do they want to step down from their position. And so no surprise, by April 1775, this would lead to eventually open rebellion at two small towns outside of Boston known as Lexington and Concord. How the battles of Lexington and Concord come into being is by April of 1775, the colonists within Massachusetts had begun to store weapons as well as gunpowder throughout several arsenals out in the countryside of Massachusetts outside of Boston. And by April, the British military governor of Massachusetts, out of one Thomas Gage, had learned word of this. And he would be given on April 14th special orders from Great Britain stating to end this potential rebellion, to go out into the countryside, arrest suspected Patriot leaders, namely that of Samuel Adams as well as several others, and get to the gunpowder arsenal that is at Concord and destroy it before the rebels could use it against the British troops. And on the night of April 18, 1775, he will give the orders for British regulars under Colonel Francis Smith to go out into the countryside to secure Concord. And they will exit Boston, cross the Charles River, and begin a, roughly, if I remember correctly, 20-mile march towards Concord. In the meantime, the British colonists outside of Boston will hear wind of this. And they will send out midnight riders, most notably Paul Revere as well as William Dawes, to raise the midnight alarm to get the local militia, the Minutemen, to take up arms. Now, they're not going to go out throughout the countryside saying the British are coming, but rather they're going to go out saying the regulars or the redcoats are coming. And why are they saying that? Not the British are coming? Well, it's because everybody considered themselves British at this point within Boston, so they wouldn't know what they meant. But anyways, quickly, there will be thousands of local militiamen or Minutemen who would begin to take up arms and look to confront the British regulars. However, the first confrontation won't come until the morning of April 19th, around 5 a.m. on the Lexington Green, just inside of Lexington itself. There will be 238 British regulars who would confront roughly about 70 American Minutemen under the command of one Captain John Parker. And neither side was really looking for a confrontation, but really were trying to basically be the show of force to have the other side step down. However, this won't work. Somebody will accidentally fire a shot, and then the British are going to respond with a massive volley, everybody firing all at once, which is going to send these initial Minutemen out into the countryside. Now, the British are going to resume their march, and they will eventually come to Concord, where they will find the arsenal almost emptied, but they will burn some of the ammunition as well as guns that they do find. But the smoke cloud that ensues after this is going to attract about 5,000 colonial militiamen to converge on Concord, believing the city was on fire. When they converge on Concord, this is where we'll see another battle will take place, and rather than the battle at Lexington, this one would end in a Patriot victory. The Patriot militia would stand up to these British regulars, and over the course of the next 5 hours, throughout much of the afternoon of April 19th, it'd be a running gunfight back into Boston, to where the British soldiers were trying desperately to get back to Boston. But nonetheless, even though this battle would end in a Patriot victory, even though Boston would be surrounded by the Patriot militiamen, it was effectively the first shots of the American Revolution. And now this initial protest, this boycott, had turned to open rebellion. But even though we're in April 1775 and the first shots have been fired at the revolution, there's still a long way to go to get it to independence. Because even those militiamen who were fighting at Lexington and Concord, they believed they were fighting to restore their rights as Englishmen. But we'll see how their mind will begin to change over the course of the next roughly year and a half, which will eventually get us down to the signing of the Declaration of Independence by July 1776. But we'll talk about that in a future episode. But anyways, that brings us to an end of our lecture today over the prelude to the Revolution. But anyways, before we go, just a reminder, make sure that you read all articles, read the textbook that corresponds to this, or read the chapter in the textbook that corresponds to this topic, and also make sure you complete all outstanding assignments. But anyways, everybody go out, be safe. I'll see y'all next time.